Dear Sony, for the love of God, please stop making Spider-Man movies without Spider-Man! Coming to paperback and e-readers, Isis Dark Incubus. The goddess next door gets enthralled in a romantic entanglement with an evil incubus in this all-new Isis series adventure. Pre-order your copy of Isis Dark Incubus at Amazon.com and other online booksellers everywhere. Sony Pictures' Madam Web became the latest superhero movie to flop at the box office. And Sony Pictures' Madam Web, which is supposed to be starring Dakota Johnson, Sydney Sweeney, and Adam Scott, performed even worse than Sony's last box office flop, which was the Morbius movie, and only garnered $25 million over its 6-day opening. Now, that's really embarrassing when you consider the success of the first superhero movie over at Sony, 2002's Spider-Man, which basically went on to make $80 million in its opening weekend and further went on to make $825 million and became the number 3 movie of 2002. And Madam Web, which cost $80 million, basically was a disaster from the day one when it was basically announced, and this movie was destined to flop because it followed one precept that Sony keeps trying to make into a business model for its Spider-Man and Spider-Verse movies, and that is trying to go out here and make Spider-Man movies featuring supporting characters in Spider-Man's whole lore. Now, this whole concept is absolutely ridiculous because you can't make Spider-Man movies without Spider-Man, but we have executives at Sony who think that going out and trying to make Spider-Man movies without Spider-Man will allow them to make big box office, but all it does is alienate all of those comic fans who see these films as absolutely ridiculous and derivative. And when it comes to Madam Web, this is one of the most derivative of the Spider-Man without Spider-Man movies, and the movie basically fell completely apart ever since the day it was announced and it went into development, because this whole concept of Madam Web just doesn't work at all, and it doesn't work because Madam Web only works with Spider-Man. And what's really sad about the development of this movie is that these people, as they were trying to do this concept of a Spider-Man movie without Spider-Man, sadly were not comic fans and did not care anything about the source material that they were working with. With this whole Madam Web movie, you had a bunch of people who knew nothing about the comic books or the character of Madam Web, or knew nothing about the Spider-Man side of the Marvel Universe, and here we had these people going out here and creating a movie about a comic book character without ever reading a single comic book. And when I look at what's happening with Madam Web, it basically reminds me of what happened with 2004's Catwoman, which was directed by Patoff and basically wound up starting the complete decline of Halle Berry's career after she won the Oscar, because that film, while it also had a big budget of $100 million, wanted to try to focus on star power without ever thinking about creating a story that was true to the source material. And what happened was they wound up trying to make their own adaptation, and they wound up making a huge flop back in 2004 with Catwoman. And what's really sad with Hollywood is that these studios basically haven't learned their lesson in over 20 years since Catwoman flopped, and we have Sony basically following the same failed business model and going out and trying to make this Madam Web movie, not ever looking at what made Catwoman in 2004 a box office failure, because 2004's Catwoman and Sony Pictures' Madam Web follow the same paradigm of failure in trying to go out here and use a star like Dakota Johnson to overcompensate for their lack of story, which is presented by an inexperienced screenwriter who has multiple box office failures under their belt, and an inexperienced director who does not have enough projects to be able to go out here and make a superhero movie. However, that didn't deter the executives at Sony, who were mainly focused on trying to go out here and trying to make box office by trying to go out and make a movie with a spin-off Spider-Man character, hoping that the character would catch on by themselves if they create their own concept. However, the concept that they make is so weak and so ridiculous that it just is not strong enough to even carry this absolutely puerile movie that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And it's clear to me that the studio basically didn't have much faith in this so-called girl power movie, because they went out and started to set this entire movie not in the Venomverse, not even in the 2002 Spider-Man universe. No, they created it within its own universe, and they did that because they basically knew that this film was going to be a turkey. And because they knew it was going to be a turkey, what they did was decide to set this in its own world so that it wouldn't do any sort of damage to their other franchises, like the Venom franchise. And they did that because they didn't want this film tied to anything, because they know about how when you have a terrible movie in an interconnected universe, the damage that can be done to an entire universe from the numerous box office failures of MCU's Phase 4, and the MCU's Fail 5, Phase 5. Because if you have a series of phases and you have bad movies tied to it, it basically tanks the entire franchise. And in order to mitigate the damage that would be done by Madam Web being woven into the Sony Venomverse or the Spider-Verse or even the MCU, they basically put it in its own world. And that just, again, shows me the lack of confidence all of those individuals over at Sony have in this Spider-Man movie that's without Spider-Man. And as I've learned about the entire story of Madam Web, it's not an intricate web of a woman who has psychic powers. No, what it is just a convoluted mess of plot threads that just aren't worthy of a script. But that didn't stop anybody over at Sony, because the people at Sony thought, oh, superheroes are popular and people will watch anything. But no, when it comes to discerning comic book and sci-fi and fantasy fans like myself, ever since 2004 with Catwoman, people have been on message boards trying to tell everybody that the only way we want to watch superhero movies is if they are true to the source material. I remember being on the superhero hype boards when Catwoman was getting ready to come out, and the backlash that movie received, even with Halle Berry starring, people were on there saying that they didn't like that whole movie with Patience Phillips because it was not in the comics, and this whole story was not in the comics, and that was basically what alienated people from that movie and wound up torpedoing the careers of Patoff as related to being a director and Halle Berry as an actress. And basically people were telling them, again, 20 years ago, this isn't the kind of superhero movie that people want to see. But these tone-deaf executives over at places like Sony really don't want to listen to all of those comic fans, which would have been the base for a Madam Web movie. And they didn't really want a Madam Web movie. No, what most comic fans wanted is a Spider-Man movie that would feature Madam Web as a supporting cast member, and they want a Spider-Man movie that features these characters and Spider-Man stories. That's what comic fans want. But the studios like Sony don't want to give us these movies. No, they arrogantly believe that we will just go out here and watch anything with a superhero character. However, that's not what most comic fans and most superhero fans want. No, what comic fans and superhero fans want, again, are authentic movies that are true to the comics and the source material. And we want people who are working on these movies to be passionate about these characters and be passionate enough to go out and read the source material and make a script that is true to the source material, and then also make sure that everything is lining up with the source material. That's what comic fans want. Unfortunately, what the executives want to do is try to transpose their whole activism on into these movies and make them movies that are going to push their social justice and identity politics agendas without any sort of structure of story or any sort of creative form that makes these movies comic books back to life, coming to life. That's what people want, but studios don't seem to want to give us that. And then they sit there and wonder why these movies wind up failing at the box office. And these movies wind up failing at the box office because people want Spider-Man movies with Spider-Man characters to feature Spider-Man and his supporting cast, not his supporting cast in an alternate universe where there are no stakes whatsoever and plots that make absolutely no sense whatsoever. I mean, this Madam Web story, from what I've read, is absolutely ridiculous and seems like something just cooked up to just make a fast dollar at the box office, but not give the viewer and the audience a quality story. And that's what is making people upset. And it basically, what's really causing the decline of this entire superhero trend are these cash grab movies. And ironically, these cash grab movies are costing the studio a bunch of money. I mean, this movie, even though it cost on the lower end of the budget, $80 million, basically is a huge flop because in 6 days, if you compare it to the 2002 Spider-Man, the 2002 Spider-Man in the 6 days of its opening had basically made over $200 million at the box office, but this film that cost $80 million in 6 days could only make $25 million, and yeah, that's a certified flop, and it's a certified flop not because it featured heroines. It's based on the execution of the concept because they wanted to do a movie about strong women without showing any strength of character and not really showing any sort of substance whatsoever. That's why this movie basically flopped, and it really shows a really sad turn, and a sad turn as related to the trend of the superhero movie, that we seem to be regressing to the dark days of the late 80s and the early 90s, where there was no real care as related to the source material, because what was presented in Madam Web basically took me back to the dark days of the 80s with The Incredible Hulk Returns, where we got the late Bill Bixby as the Incredible Hulk and Lou Ferrigno as the Hulk, and we got Eric Kramer as what we were told to be Thor, but that Thor basically wasn't a guy who turns into an Asgardian god. It was a guy who picks up a hammer and calls on a god, and that was one of the worst things that I've ever seen. And it just showed how little care they had for the source material. But what's really sad is that had more heart and more care than what we saw with Madam Web. And the web that's being woven by the people who produce movies like Madam Web show us that they have a rickety structure, and that rickety structure is why everything has fallen apart as related to the modern superhero movie. Now, my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is available on Lulu.com right now, and you can pick up your paperback copy of John Haynes at Death's Door by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to pick up my first full digital comic I did with Bill Walko, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents on Amazon.com by clicking the link in the description box as well. And if you want to help me to be able to make my next comic, or be able to make more videos about comics, or buy more great indie comics on Kickstarter, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Coming to paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Illuminati. The man who rules the world takes on the head of the global elite in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Pre-order your copy of John Haynes, Illuminati on Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Now available on Lulu. John Haynes at death's door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at lulu.com today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.